Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is NZXT's Kraken X73 RGB. Here you can see it mounted in the Lian Li Dynamic XL, which I've done a video on before, and this is an unboxing video where I'll be showing off the RGB flavoured X73 360mm cooler and showing you how to set it up and the various features and facets of it, as well as the highlights and lowlights. Now this is an interesting cooler from NZXT because this is an updated version of the previous X73, which I've unboxed, installed and reviewed previously, so check out that video in the description. But now it includes 3 of NZXT's Aer RGB version 2 fans, 120mm fans that are fluid dynamic bearing, said to run quietly and capable of 500 to 1500 RPM with a CFM of 52.44, and I'll leave all those specs and information in the description below. But it's worth noting that the Kraken X73 RGB has a warranty of up to 6 years, which makes it pretty interesting on its own. The header also has 9 LEDs on it, and the RGB lighting is controllable within NZXT's Cam software, which I'll show you later on in the video. I also did some benchmarking on it, so I'll be able to show you the tests for that. And for reference, I'm setting this up with an Intel Core i9-10900K CPU. That's 1200 socket, but this cooler will fit multiple different sockets. But Intel's LGA 1200, 1151, 1150, 1155, 1156, 1366, 2011 and 2066. It'll also fit multiple AMD, AM4, TR4 and various other setups, but out of the box it comes set up with Intel's mounting brackets, and I'll talk to you about how to set it up for the LGA 1200 as I go through. Now, as I said, it's included with NZXT's Aer RGB fans that you can see here. They basically have a ring around the front section. That's the intake area, so that's pulling air through the fan. So if you want to get the RGB lighting, you need to basically exhaust over the radiator, and I'll show you that as we go through. In the box you get those 3 fans, you get multiple cables, you get the brackets for the AM4 setup, and also back plates for the Intel setup that I'll talk to you about later on, and a multitude of cables. I'm going to show you how to set all this up and talk about how to connect the fans together and the end result that you want to get. For reference, I also have 4 140mm NZXT Aer RGB fans in the case that I'm using as well, that you can see basically intaking from the bottom and exhausting out the top too. Now the pump head itself comes with thermal paste pre-applied, and as I said, it has the Intel bracket pre-installed in it. You need to remove that bracket around the outside and install the AM4 one if you want to use AMD's setup instead. Fairly straightforward process, and I'll leave a link to the manual in the description. It's basically an online manual that you can download, which is handy because it means you can have it on your phone, for example, to get easy access to it. Here you can see the 360mm radiator. It's also worth noting there is an X73 RGB version, which is obviously the smaller one, and I'll link to the official pages in the description so you can find out more, as well as where to purchase if you're interested. The fans themselves are pretty cool as well. I actually found the setup process for these to be pretty interesting. They're fairly modular, not in the same way as Lian Li's SL120s, which I did a video on recently, but if you note, they have connection options on them. As standard, they only have 1 power cable coming out of them, but because they're RGB fans, they obviously need that extra cable for the RGB lighting, and I'll talk to you a bit more about that later on. Out of the box, you can also see the AMD bracket here, a metal bracket which basically swaps out with the Intel one, and then you have the Intel back plate that I'll talk to you a bit more about later on as we go through. You'll also find the standoff screws for the different Intel setups and the thumb screws that hold the pump head in place. You'll have the long screws and the small screws for the fan radiator setup, and which ones you're using will vary depending on how you're setting it up, and I'll talk to you about that as I go on. And then the AM4 standoff setup as well. Slightly different setup process, but the instructions are fairly straightforward, actually really well done. Then you have a multitude of cables, which might look scary if you've not set this sort of thing up before, but they're actually fairly straightforward, and I'll cover them off as we go through. The first of which is a micro USB connection that plugs into the pump head, and then that USB connection connects to the USB header on your motherboard. You then have a breakout cable, one bit of which plugs into the pump head again, and then it has multiple other connections. One goes to the CPU fan header on your motherboard, and then there's one for your RGB lighting and one for SATA power. You then have another cable which has 3 male connections on it and then 1 single connection. That essentially allows you to connect up the power for all 3 fans into 1 single connection that you can then plug into a controller or onto a header on your motherboard. You then have these in and out cables, which for the RGB lighting, they essentially just go between the different fans and allow you to connect them up. This longer one that I've got in my hand actually runs from the final fan in your setup to the breakout cable on the pump head. I'll show you that a bit later on, but there are smaller connections which allow you to basically loop these fans, link them together and create one long chain of glorious RGB lighting on the radiator. Fans themselves are nice looking. They run reasonably well, quite quietly. NZXT claims they're very quiet. I actually think they're louder than the SL 120s, noticeably louder even on quiet and silent modes. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean they're completely obnoxious though. They are bearable. You can't hear them as I'm talking now, for example, with my PC running in the background, so they're not obnoxiously loud, but they aren't dead quiet either. The RGB lighting is obviously only on one side as well, so if you are thinking of doing an intake on your radiator instead of an exhaust, then you're going to miss out on the RGB lighting, which is a shame. It doesn't have a ring on both sides like the Corsair QL 120s, for example, but the setup process for them is a lot easier than the Corsair QL 120s or Corsair's LL 120s because of this daisy chaining system for the RGB lighting. Normally with an RGB fan you have 2 different cables coming out. You have the power cable and you have the RGB cable. And you do in this case have that as well, but you don't have to run all of those to a control box or to your motherboard because you can run the RGB lighting between the fans, and then you just have a single connection that you connect at the end, which then powers all the fans that are on the radiator, so it makes for a nice easy setup. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mount those fans onto the radiator in the way that you probably will be if you're setting up in a similar way to me. Basically we're setting it up so that you're pulling air across over the rad and out of the case, and whether you're mounting it on the top or the side, it's obviously going to be a personal preference thing, but I am looking to mount this on the side of my case as you've seen already at the beginning, and I want to make sure that the cables that you can see here on the left hand side are running into the back and will be out of view as much as possible. It is worth noting that it makes sense to screw the fans in now into the radiator and also to connect them up with the small daisy chaining system as well before you mount it in the case, because afterwards it'll be very fiddly because of the way the in and out cables connect. They're a bit of a faff. It is really easy to screw the fans into the radiator though, joyful. Previous Corsair, for example, all-in-one coolers that I've set up have been a nightmare for screwing in the fans. This one has not got that problem at all. So now the little cables that you've got, the smallest ones with the in-out markings on them, basically connect in between the different fans that are on there. You just have 2 cables that go out and in into that, and then it's just looping the RGB lighting between them so that they can be daisy chained together and connected up at the end to the breakout cable on the pump head, which then allows you to control the RGB lighting. The other option you have is that you could connect them up to a separate NZXT RGB controller, and I'll show you an example of that later on, but it's going to depend on whether you've got multiple RGB fans and lighting modules within the case and how you want to set that up. Things get a bit more complicated there. The next step is you have that other cable, which is a fan splitter cable, which allows you to connect the 3 fans together into a single connection. So there's a cable in the box which is separate that has 3 male connections on it that plug into the power connection there, and then that results in a single connection. I've shown you this from a distance, from a different angle, and you can see the process. Basically, I'm plugging all three into this connection here that then results in a single power connection. You can then connect that either to the system fan header on your motherboard or into a controller, and I'll show you that a bit later on as well. Now, on the pump head itself, there are two connections. The micro USB connection that I already showed you, you need to connect that up and plug that into the USB header on your motherboard. And then the other one, which is the breakout cable from the pump head, that has multiple connections on it. That's probably the most intimidating looking one, but the instructions are fairly clear on how to set it up. I'm going to show you it anyway for ease of use. So basically you have multiple different connections here. This single one is the one that you want, that then plugs into the pump head. And I'd recommend doing this for both the micro USB and for this main breakout cable before you install the pump head on top of the CPU, because once you've got it inside the case, it can be a bit of a faff to get these in. You can see I'm having trouble just trying to set it up and install it basically before it's even in there, so it's a bit fiddly. The micro USB one's a bit easier to do, obviously. And again, that plugs into the USB header on your motherboard, which is at the bottom generally. You'll find more on that on your motherboard manual to make life a little bit easier. Now, one of the cables that comes out, the breakout cable that plugs into the pump head, is this one, which is essentially the RGB link. So the longer of the in-out RGB cables, that is the one that plugs into that, and that plugs into the final connection on your fans that sit on the radiator. That then allows you to control the RGB lighting from within NZXT Cam software, which, as I said, I'll show you a bit later on. But the end result, once the fans are all set up and the in and out cables are connected, you can see it here of what it looks like. And then, as I said, you just plug in that final one into the fan and then into the header on the pump. Makes it fairly straightforward setup process. Certainly a lot easier than the multiple cables you'd see on other RGB fans. Now, for the next step, we're looking to set up the back plate for the Intel. There are different setups in the way that these screws fit depending on which one you're installing. As I said, I'm installing the 1200 socket. We've got to make sure it's angled correctly, so you see where the little rivets are on the left and right. You need to make sure that they're fitting in that way. The backplate is a bit of a fiddle to install depending on the setup of your case. In my case, my hard disk drive tray is in the way of one of the top standoffs, which makes it a bit of a fiddle to do. I'd recommend that when you're installing this, you also keep a spare hand free and room to be able to reach around the back and hold on to the backplate while you're then putting the standoff screws in on the front. That basically ensures that they don't pop out, because it is a bit of a faff. It was a real pain for me, especially with this hard disk drive tray around the back of it. But once you do it, you should then see them jutting out through the front. This is going to vary depending on your setup, because, for example, LGA 2066 doesn't even require a backplate at all, so you don't need to worry with that setup, and you basically just use the standoff screws. There are two lots of Intel standoff screws in there. Note the difference between them. One side is shorter than the other. The ones I want for the 1200 socket are the same length on both sides, but the other ones are for 2066, and you'll find more on that in the instruction manual. But as I said, reach through to the back and hold that back plate in place while you screw them in, and make sure that they're screwed in tight so that they are set down properly, and then the pump head will be a lot easier to install once we get to that. Basically then just go through the process of screwing those down, and then the next step is to mount the radiator and install the pump head. Now, my initial plan was to set it up with the fans installed on the radiator and then install the radiator to the case, which is probably what you will be doing. Most people might top mount their radiator on the top of their case, so you basically use the small screws to screw in through the case into the rad. The problem I came across, which I actually experienced previously with the other X73, and it isn't caused by the radiator or the X73 setup, it's caused by my case. My motherboard has two USB front headers on it because I have multiple USB ports on the front of this case. Those cables unfortunately get in the way of the radiator when it sticks through at this distance. So what I ended up having to do was what I did with the original X73 and with the Z73, which is basically remove the fans and mount the radiator at the back of the case behind the recess instead, and then fit the fans to the radiator through the case using the longer screw. So this is an option if you have the same case as me, or if you're considering it. There are multiple different ways to set this up, and NZXT has guidance within the manual on how to do it and what you need to do to get the best results. This is obviously going to vary from case to case as well, but basically I'll strip mine down to just the radiator and then I'll fed it through to the back of the case. Another point of note here is I will probably have some people commenting saying that I've fit my radiator the wrong way up. Gamers Nexus did a video on the best way to mount your all-in-one coolers to ensure longevity of the pump head and make sure it keeps running quietly and effectively over time, and I'll link to that in the description. But essentially it means the tubes should be at the bottom, and it is possible in this case, but it is very, very tight with those tubes basically running over the GPU. You could top mount it instead as an alternative, but I like it set up like this and it works fine for me, and it will work fine. I've run rads like this for a long time without any problems. Once that the fan is installed, the first fan is installed, it's a lot easier to install the other ones because they're all held together with those cables. So I lay the case flat and then I go about the process of basically just screwing them in. As I said, I'm screwing through the fan, through the case and into the rad. That then holds the whole thing in place, which is fairly easy. It basically means you're only using the long screws. You don't need to worry about the shorter, smaller ones. Once that's done, I'm now moving back to the front of the case and installing the pump head. As I said, this comes pre-installed with thermal paste. You can just use that as it is, comes out of the box, just put it on top of your CPU and you're away. You can, if you so wish, purchase aftermarket thermal paste such as Thermal Grizzly's pads, for example, or Arctic Cooling. There are various different recommended thermal pastes out there, but I found this one to be sufficient, and I will do benchmarks at the end of this video to show you the temperatures I got as well with it running under pressure in this setup. Now, the benefit of this pump head is that it's set up in a way that you can basically install it in any position you want. Essentially, the top of the screen actually turns around really easily, and you can basically turn it into the correct position so that it will still have the display on it, and I'll show you a bit more on that later on. Then it is then held in place with these thumb screws that are dead easy to seat. Now, one of the things I had with the Z73 was the pump tube fit very tight and pressed up against my RAM. That isn't a problem I've had with the X73 RGB, and hopefully you won't either. The setup process is really straightforward and easy, basically putting that pump head down and screwing it down with the thumb screws, making sure it's held nicely in place. And as I said, make sure you fit your cables before you get to this point, because it's a lot easier, especially with that breakout cable that comes from the pump head, to make sure that's in there. There's a small 3-pin cable that comes out the pump head as well. That should connect to either the CPU header on your motherboard or the AIO pump header, depending on your motherboard setup and what you're doing. I use the CPU fan header for mine, and it works well like that. Then you need to go through the process of setting up the other cables. As I said, I have the 3 power connections for the fans coming from the radiator as they're installed into a single connection. Now, I also have this NZXT fan controller. You might just install that connection to one of the system fans on your motherboard, but if you have a controller like this, because you have other NZXT fans that you want to attach to it, then you can plug it in there for a fan 1, for example. This control box needs power, so SATA power, and another USB header on your motherboard, but you'll note that it has 2 connections for LED and 3 for fans. So it's 3 fan power connections and 2 RGB LED connections to it as well, which means that you can connect up multiple different NZXT RGB things, whether that's fan or RGB light strips. And because of the modular way that these fans work, you can connect up multiple fans together as well, so you don't necessarily have to worry about how many connections you have, but you will need multiple splitters potentially. So in this case, I used the LED connections on there for the top and bottom fans in the case, which are 140mm AER2 RGB fans as well. and then the RGB lighting header connects to the pump head. I have a splitter cable connected to that, 3 fans on the radiator that then plugs into that, and then the 2 fans at the top are plugged into fan 1 and fan 2, but the 2 fans at the bottom I've had to plug into the system header because I didn't have another splitter cable, so it's really going to vary. Obviously you might not have NZXT fans necessarily, you might just be using the radiator, but I thought I'd just mention this. It's another consideration. There are various different ways to set it up essentially. The end result, as you can see, this is the default RGB lighting. I'm going to show you how to change the lighting and what it looks like as we go through. I want to show a close-up of that pump head again though. So you might find that you have fit it in a way, for example, if you mount it on the top or the bottom, you might find that it doesn't install with it in the perfect position, but you can turn that round and get it so that the NZXT logo is in the right place, because this logo is permanently etched there. It can't be customized within the software, for example, but you can turn that head round so you make sure that it ends up with a nice result. Now the head itself has been improved over the previous versions, and it has what looks like a deeper mirror effect to it, and it looks really nice. As you'll see as well, those Aer RGB fans look really good too. They don't have any particular hotspots on them. They're not really obvious in where the lighting is, and they just look really nice. The RGB lighting on them is really good, and the end result looks really good too. Very impressive lighting, really easy on the eye, and there is a variety of different settings in there. As I said though, I don't feel like they're as quiet, even on the quieter modes, as SL120s, but they're quieter than Corsair's QL120s based on experience, and they are very nice looking. And if you have NZXT fans already, obviously having these RGB fans as an addition to the all-in-one cooler is fantastic. The pump head too looks really nice, although I personally prefer the Z73 with the customizable screen on it with GIFs and all sorts of the data readouts and things like that, but that is a lot more expensive. So if you want a good quality, nice looking cooler which has a ridiculous warranty on it, 6 years obviously instills confidence in the product and how confident NZXT is in the quality of their product, that you shouldn't have any problems with it. Very nice looking cooler, and it does a good job too, as I'll show you later on when I do some benchmarking. So stick with me to the end and I'll show you the benchmarks, and I'll include those in the description as well. Now once we're into Windows, you can use NZXT's Cam software. That offers various different things, including PC monitoring, system spec access, overclocking and all sorts of other things. But for just this video, I'm going to be showing you how to adjust the RGB lighting. You can see that at the top I have the other fans in the case on there, but I also have the fans on the Kraken radiator, and you can see the various different RGB effects that you can go through. There are absolutely loads of them. They're easy to access and easy to change, and you can customize the speed of them, the lighting direction, and also the brightness too. And there's loads of different ones, really nice RGB effects that go on in here, but there's also ones that you can choose which basically change the RGB lighting to vary it up depending on what's happening on your PC. So if you're listening to music, for example, you can get the RGB lighting to respond to that. One thing that you can do though, you can see that you can customize the ring on the pump head, and you can customize various sections of it bit by bit and change the color on that too. And that also has numerous different visual effects on it. If you're just choosing a standard color or going through some of the various different effects, and you know, even when you change those, you can choose the color that the effects are going through as well. So for example, if we're using it on pulse, you can see it's defaults to purple, but you can choose other ones. If you use something like spectrum wave, obviously that goes through a variety of different colors. Again, you can change the speed and brightness and all sorts of other things. You'll also note that the NZXT logo can be separately edited so that you can change the lighting on that as well, which means that you can customize the look and feel of that too, which is certainly nice. And that, but it is worth noting that even if you set that to black, it doesn't disappear entirely because it's basically etched there, so it's impossible for it to disappear. You can't make it go completely blank and just have the ring. Even if you turn it off or turn the brightness down, you can still see it. You can see it here in the video and how that shows up. Now, I've been using this for a while. gaming, working, and just generally getting up to mischief on my PC. And here I just ran some pretty aggressive benchmarking after a day of working while still using Spotify, Discord, Slack, Ubisoft, Origin, all sorts of other things. I also ran Cinebench R23 and PC Mark at the same time. You can see my CPU is up to 5 gigahertz. It's running with extreme performance set up in MSI's Dragon Center, which is my motherboard software, and you can see the core temperature is up to 88 degrees centigrade, the socket temperature at around 62. Pretty hot, but still running very effectively, and the cooler is keeping it cool enough. It is under 100% load, as you can see from Task Manager, so it is getting a bit of a beating. But I will leave all the details, including a link to PC Mark, the benchmark score, in the description, so you can find out more and see for yourself what the results were. But from what I've seen, it performs well and it keeps the CPU nice and cool during gaming sessions, and just general day-to-day use. I've certainly not had any problems on my system at all. The one point of note is that the fans are louder than the SL120s, which is a disappointment, but otherwise a very nice bit of kit. Hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions and what you think of the X73 RGB. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Hope you found it useful, interesting, hilarious, or all of the above. Be sure to check out the description for other information you might find interesting, and subscribe and watch these other videos as well that I think might be useful to you, and have a great life.